welcome everyone to the Equi-law and the all-party parliamentary group on issues affecting Men and Boys fringe meeting, which is based on the case for a Minister for Men. And I'm Mark Brooks and I'm the policy advisor for the APPG, and I'll be chairing the meeting today. Having been to practically every Conservative Party conference since 1992, I'm pretty confident this is the very first time that there has been a conference fringe meeting on this subject. And so we have some real catching up to do, but now the time seems right given the issues that men and boys face in the UK today. So just to make sure you know how matters will run, we will initially hear thoughts from our wonderful range of speakers, and then we'll open it up to the floor. All of our parliamentarians are members of the all-party parliamentary group, and they've all been active members since it was created 18 months ago. With excellent support from our secretariat, from Equi-law, Mike Bell, who's done a fantastic job in organising this. We've already produced, over the last 18 months, 3 really important reports. One on what it's like to be a boy in Britain today, that came out last year. The case for a men's health strategy that came out in February, and also just last week, why we need a new approach to tackling male suicide in the UK. So this is a really important APPG in terms of the work that it's doing in terms of inclusion, diversity, and of course equality. So I'm just going to introduce our speakers. To my immediate left, Ben Bradley MP. He's been a Member of Parliament for Mansfield since 2017. First time Mansfield has ever returned a Conservative Member of Parliament. And he's also the leader of Nottinghamshire County Council since 2021. He led the International Men's Day debate in Parliament in 2020 and was also the first member in this Parliament to call for a Minister for Men. Next to him, we've got Nick Fletcher, MP. He's a Member of Parliament for Don Valley since 2019. Again, the first time Don Valley has had a Conservative Member of Parliament, and he's chair of the All Parliamentary Group. And he led the International Men's Day debate in Parliament last year and has been particularly focused over the last year on the need for a men's health strategy. In the middle, we've got Caroline Ansell MP. She's a Member of Parliament for Eastbourne and Willington, and was initially elected between 2015 and 2017, and then thankfully won again in 2019. She's a keen believer in the family and the value of the education system, especially as she was a teacher for 15 years. Next to Caroline is Lord Michael Farmer. He was created a life peer by David Cameron in 2014 and has been a vocal supporter of welfare and prison reform and the importance of family and the role of fathers. He's also the co-founder of the Family Hubs Network and a member of the Conservative Party Foundation. And on the end, we've got Dr. Samantha Callan, who's a fellow of the Centre for Social Justice and a co-founder and director of the Family Hubs Network. She's a published academic and been involved in research and policy development on strengthening families and also children's early years for family law reform. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Ben.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for coming along. Really great to see a full house from that point of view for what is a really important conversation, and one that can sometimes be unpopular, sometimes get you a bit of flack for talking about, in truth. And I think all of us who've raised some of these issues over recent years have experienced some of the backlash, actually, which is really sad for talking about some of these challenges, not least when I first raised the concept of having a minister responsible for men's issues, which I got absolutely slated for. We've moved on and we've recovered ourselves. I just want to touch on a couple of things, some of the fundamentals about why I think the system doesn't work, particularly for the most disadvantaged men and boys, actually, in our society. And I'm going to draw on some examples, particularly from education, as to why the system is rigged in the wrong direction. I think that men and boys issues are compounded by rather than helped by the Equality Act. I don't think it's fit for purpose in that sense. I often hear people misuse and misrepresent the Equality Act and say that young boys don't have a protected characteristic in that sense. Now, obviously, male protected characteristic, as is female, and equally so as female. And people misunderstand that all the time. So in that sphere, men and boys don't count in the conversation about protected characteristics or about positive action in that space. So we hear about the negative impact on others. We talk about female issues and in the context of men and boys as oppressors, as violent, as a problem. And that leads, I think, to the degradation of our traditional values of things like family, of traditional male role models, descriptions of strength, leadership, being a provider, seen all of a sudden in the context of a negative thing, which raises the question, which speaks to some of the things that no doubt colleagues will raise about men's health, men's mental health, as what are men for? And as a young man in society today, my fear is that that is a question that too many young men are unable to answer in the modern context. It leads to uncertainty, leads to depression, leads to a cycle of real health issues for young men and male suicide, which is a horrendous issue. It has kind of, to a certain extent, erased the traditional male role model, the traditional role of men in society in a way that I think is really unhealthy. And one example of this as to how I think the Equality Act makes the system worse is in education. And we see particularly young men from disadvantaged backgrounds, and economic disadvantage isn't a protected characteristic, even though actually typically it's the biggest driver of inequality in our country, geographical and economic inequality, rather than physical characteristics of any kind. But it's not a protected characteristic, and it's disadvantaged young men who are most likely to leave school with no qualifications, who are least likely to be able to go to university. And yet we don't see positive action in that sense to support young men and boys in that space. We see all sorts, quite rightly and helpfully and understandably, to support women into STEM subjects, for example. I think that's fantastic, and that's a brilliant thing to be able to do, where you can recognise that there is an inequality, you can recognise that women are not represented equally or fairly in STEM subjects. That's absolutely right and a good thing to do. You very rarely see programmes to help young boys into primary school teaching or young men into nursing, for example, where there is equal underrepresentation, where equally those role models and those young men could play a strong and positive role in our society, particularly in primary schools. I'm really passionate about the role of male role models in primary schools, which I think is a huge gap in our system. But you don't see those programmes because young men don't have any protected characteristics, which is really, really unhelpful. And that makes the inequality worse. There's a prime example. When young men are least likely to go to university, particularly young white men, that's a whole other conversation that we don't need to get into today, but where I've done a lot of work and research. If the most disadvantaged young men are least likely to go to university and you have positive action programmes to support more women to go to university, no problem with that, but that actually makes the inequality worse if you don't have programmes supporting young boys as well. I'd make a similar case in different conversations, as I say, about race as the same issue and the same lack of understanding as the Equality Act. But education is one example where I think it really works against young men. And you could point to others. Violence and crime is another one. Health and health strategies is another one. And none of this is meant to be negative or disparaging to the fantastic work that's done to support young women. And particularly, I feel passionately about economic inequalities, particularly the most disadvantaged young women in our society, tackling historic inequalities that are very real and very important. But I'm really concerned that we leave a lot of young men and boys behind, and that we leave a lot of young men and boys confused about what their role is and should be in our society, and particularly those young men and boys who don't start with a cultural advantage in the first place, who come from the most disadvantaged of our communities around the country. So I got a lot of stick for the Minister of Men comment in that debate a few years ago. You can decide for yourself whether I was literally calling for one or not, or whether perhaps people might want to look into the context of that a little bit more. But what I was trying to do is to serve to highlight some of these challenges, that it's not good enough to ignore some of the challenges that are very real and statistically very real about the problems that young men face around suicide, around health, around the way that they are portrayed, I think, in modern society, and the mental health issues that causes. And we have legislation, we have systems, we have ways of working that I think actively make that worse, actually. in our society as it stands today. So really important that we have this conversation. I'm looking forward to getting your thoughts and comments on it as well. But I hope that's a useful and interesting start, and hand over to colleagues to take it on from there.
Okay, thanks very much, Ben. I think I'm next one on, and I'm going to be actually ending up on talking about prisons. But I think I'll just start with the whole issue of family breakdown in this country. And I think you may not be aware, but in the OECD, I mean, we are one of the worst. We're at the bottom of 32 countries or so on how many family breakdowns we have. We have had very poor policies from different colours of government on strengthening families. There's been more of a culture of individualism, liberal individualism, which has really cost families. And from the breakdown of families, I mean, we have 44% of children not living with both their parents, and we have the iconic single mum. Well, there is the iconic single mum. We're always being talked about the struggle she's being put up with, and the children, the difficulty. Well, absolutely. I mean, it's a big struggle. And I often say in Parliament, you know what? I bet you she would like to have a man about, but somebody to help. But we keep lifting up this iconic single mum, and we don't seem to ask ourselves what's happened to the dad. We've got to break down the family, and the dad's gone off. He's probably paying maintenance. He isn't seeing his children, or he's having difficulty in seeing his children. His relationships have broken down. The whole family relationship structure has broken down, which results in all sorts of things. Often, I mean, it's welfare dependency, often homelessness, self-harm, suicide, etc. The whole area of family strengthening is a policy which this government, the Conservative government, the Conservative Party, the Party for Families, should be attending to, but it isn't. Now, how do we look at men? I was on the Domestic Abuse Scrutiny Committee, okay? All the way through that, there was this sort of effort to genderize it, or to make it a female one. It was all the abuse was male on female. Well, the actual data and research clearly shows that 30% of domestic abuse is on males. Some of it is male on male, but it is sometimes women on male. That was really neglected. Thankfully, the bill went through without being what they called genderized. But it just showed the attitude that we have in society and our culture towards men. Now, men in prison. Now, probably some of you do know the stats. How many men in prison? How many women in prison? Well, I'll tell you. There are 4,000 women in prison. There are 80,000 men in prison. Now, that is huge. And what do I find when I go around the prisons? I find there's this great big movement. We can't have a woman in prison because they're a victim. Something's happened to them. Well, actually, a lot of women have done very bad things and they should be in prison. A lot of men have done very bad things and they should be in prison. But there's no understanding of why we have 80,000 men in prison and only 4,000 women in prison. And I was recently in Peterborough, which is the only prison in Britain which has male and female. And this was a meeting about women and about the trauma that they have in prison. And a lot of research had been done. A professor done a paper on it. It was very powerful. They were talking about the women screaming at night in their cells. Why? Because they were missing the purpose of their life. They were missing being a mother. They were missing being a carer. Okay, so and there was this great sort of understanding of how can we help them? How can we address this trauma of the reason for existence being taken away from them by incarceration? Do we ever look at men like that? No. You look at men in prisons, how are they described in the papers? Monsters. Frankland High Security is monster mansion. Do we ever look at what, why they're in prison, the abuse that maybe 25% of the prison population was in care, and the abuse that happened to them. So there is this great neglect of attending to men as to why they are in prison and how we can help them. To my mind, when I first started visiting prisons and doing the reviews for the Ministry of Justice on how to strengthen prisoners' family relationships in order to reduce reoffending and intergenerational crime, just on those two statistics, reoffending rate was running at 43%, all right? Revolving door, just going in and out, coming in and out, okay? Intergenerational crime was running at over 60%, all right? So if you had a father in prison, you had an over 60% chance of committing a crime yourself. It was the same statistic for women. But there you have it, the fatherlessness of many of these boys in prison. We were in Durham prison earlier this year, a reception prison. And what really hit me was it was packed full of young men who, a lot of them were on remand, some of them for murder, all sorts of other things. They were there for months, okay? That period of time is when the most suicides take place, the most self-harm takes place. All of a sudden, they've been yanked out, they've been stuck in a cell, and they think, I could be here for 20 years. You know, what's the point? I might as well kill myself. So, you know, we have a problem with how we look at men, and we have a problem of how we're helping them. And certainly, you know, I think a minister for men or for men and boys, we need to have the same emphasis on them as we do for women and girls. I mean, the fatherlessness area, you know, the whole area of fatherlessness needs to be looked at. Higher risk of joining gangs, drug abuse. They end up being a poor judge of character. They're underachieving at school, etc., and they develop addictions and etc. So this is a big issue, and I think prisons are just a picture, a very good graphic picture of how we're neglecting men and actually concentrating on women. So I'm all for Ben and his Minister for Boys, and the problems that they have should not be ignored. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I'm going to be a bit more... I'm able to be a bit more positive because I'm talking about a policy which we've helped to proliferate across the country. It's now official government policy, and that's the family hubs movement that I'll describe how that came onto the scene. It's been a very long journey. I want to talk about family hubs in the context of the importance of supporting fathers as part of the strengthening families agenda. So, as I said, it's a long story. About 15 years ago, I chaired a major report for the Centre for Social Justice, and that focused on preventing family breakdown to help address poverty. Lord Farmer's already said we're leaders internationally, a dubious honour, in the number of children growing up without both their parents, high levels of father absence, about 1 million children growing up without meaningful contact with their fathers, and family dysfunction. So the government started doing a lot of work, 2010, it's continued about helping what they called trouble families, and we loved that. But on the other hand, you've got to be really quite troubled to be a troubled family. You've got to be experiencing some fairly high levels of dysfunction. But what about early intervention? And that was the policy agenda of family hubs, because the report, as I said, 2007, Breakthrough Britain. Some of you may be aware, I did it with Ian Duncan Smith. We pioneered the concept of a national network of family hubs, and it's being piloted in half of all local authorities in England. What are family hubs? Not everyone knows. Well, they're easily accessible places in local communities which provide families, mothers and fathers, crucially, with children and young people aged 0 to 19, up to 25 if they've been in care or if there's special educational needs. They're offered early help to overcome difficulties, build stronger relationships. It's a great place for universal services, so much health can happen in family hubs, preventing people having to go to the hospital when it doesn't need to be delivered in a hospital. And as I say, they enable, very importantly, that joined up or integrated working, which can deliver better outcomes for families and, crucially, smarter use of budgets. And key to that integration is involving the voluntary and community sector, not just perhaps the big corporate charities, but the smaller ones, and also just members of the community, because we all need to belong to a community. And Dads Matter, which is an organisation in Salford's family hubs, they make sure all the family hubs, everything they do is father friendly. It's little things like walk and talk services. We all know how men like to watch cricket together. They put the world to rights because they're eyes forward, not that embarrassing, sitting across the room, which women seem to like more, and making sure that even just the decor isn't too girly in family hubs. So there's lots that can be done. But very importantly, these family hubs have a relational culture, so parents and carers aren't just recipients of services. How deadening is that? But they're valued partners. These are the people who are raising the next generation. We want these hubs to have a full range of support. So yes, it's building skills and confidence in their parenting, but also prospective or actual employees, housing tenants, other employment advice, debt, housing. Lee Anderson, the Ashfield MP, I think is one of Ben's neighbours, talked about the liberating effect. He wasn't being patronising when he talked about how families, many of them, need to learn to cook. It's not just people on benefits by far, it's across society. People need to learn to cook. He was saying these people feel actually empowered and able to face the future when they know how to put nutritious food on the table. And that's something that family hubs really need to get into and do more of. We can tend to think about parenting support, helping couples in their relationships with each other, but what about all the separating families that Lord Farmer has mentioned, these 44% of children growing up where both parents aren't living together? Well, it is essential that we have help for these separated families, not just help to keep them together, which is a worthy cause. And we were very cross with the government's no-fault divorce bill, in that the argument seemed to be, let's reduce conflict. Well, anyone who knows anything about divorce says the conflict is about money and children, the vast bulk of the conflict. It's not really about what's written on the divorce petition. It hurts, it smarts, but it's not as long-lasting. And on the subject of money, I was recently commissioned by DWP to review the Child Maintenance Service's domestic abuse policy, following the very, very sad domestic homicide of a customer of the Child Maintenance Service. And in that review, it became really clear that there was no early community-based help for both parents to reach amicable and mutually satisfactory child maintenance arrangements. Now, the paying parent, who's usually but not always the father, can often feel, from my review, it became clear, to feel the system is completely stacked against him. There's a stereotype of the feckless dad who won't pay. And I did come across cases of that where fathers withheld some or all payment to basically perpetrate psychological and emotional abuse. It wasn't pleasant, quite apart from depriving children of income. But some receiving parents, mothers in the main, could be similarly abusive by not allowing contact, whether the dad paid or not, with children, as a way of exerting control over their former partners. In Australia, where whenever parents separate, they can't file for any kind of court action until they've been through a family relationship centre programme, and they learn the impact on their children when they're using them as pawns. And that's the kind of thing family hubs could do. And there's a private family law pilot in Dorset that's being funded by the MOJ, which is just extending what family hubs can do. And I'm really looking forward to learning from that, because it's the family hub, almost like an adjoining room with the family court. So we're not going to solicitors when it could be sorted out with people maybe accessing mediation or learning, as I said. You do that and your kids will suffer. Now, we were very pleased when the Best Start for Life review, led by Andrea Leadsom, stressed the need for every new family to be able to access the local family hub network of connected buildings and services and virtual help. But engaging dads is incredibly important. Very quickly, the presence of a supportive partner during the early years reduces the likelihood of postnatal depression. We need to work much harder to involve dads in antenatal classes by opening, say, the family hub, where a lot of this stuff is happening, for longer, at weekends. And outreach, not just assuming dads will come through the door, making sure community-based midwives know how to work in a father-inclusive way. And birth registration, if you get mums and dads through the door at the earliest opportunity and you keep dads involved, then if, sadly, families do split up, it's much more likely that a father will stay involved in the family hub. And we just don't want to get stuck, though, on these the early years being the only outlet for family hubs, because children, Lord Farmer's mentioned relationships. We all, especially children, need these nurturing relationships. Yes, safe but secure, nurturing relationships throughout childhood to thrive, because childhood sets that kind of relational template for good or ill, and the inability to build and maintain well-functioning relationships will hold adults back through life. And as I said, the continuation of conflict, it doesn't just end at the divorce or separation. It is one of the reasons why, as I think I mentioned before, 1 million children have no significant contact with their father. So I'm just going to say very briefly, boys without fathers statistically have a higher risk of low self-esteem, mental health issues, underachieving in school and then dropping out of education, antisocial behaviour, substance misuse, being engaged in criminal activity. We cannot ignore the role of dads, and we need to do all we can to make sure they get the support that the mums get too. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's really good to see everybody here today. I confess this is my first experience quite like this, just sort of settling to it. And I think in Westminster tradition, we would open by declaring any personal or pecuniary interest that might influence the contribution that we are to go on to make. I have 3 teenage sons, all trying to navigate their way in the world and answer that question, what are men for and what is my place? And just behind that, I would say on my way here, when asked by a couple of sort of fellow delegates, what event was I attending next? I said, it's a panel discussion to look at the case for a Minister for Men. Why? Why? A genuine question. Well, sort of representing 49% of the population. For all the very same reasons that we have done such tremendous work in focusing on some very specific needs for women. All the same thinking applies, whether that is around health or around performance and in education. Why would we not need to create a specific response to some issues that are most particularly challenging to boys and men? And I take just one particular challenge that I've been working on locally, and that is around domestic violence. I'm working very closely with Sussex Police. Now, we've already heard, and it's absolutely incontestable, that in majority numbers, women are far more likely to experience domestic violence. But in terms of some of the investment and policy work around prevention, 1% is spent on perpetrator programs. 1%. And the same research suggests that offenders, in the majority male, might have, in the course of their life, up to 6 victims. And yet 1% is dedicated to engaging with perpetrators to try to change some of that behaviour. And sitting just behind that perpetrator identity is 9 times out of 10 a little boy or a young man who themselves either witnessed domestic violence at home or were the victim of that same violence. And yet we spend 1%. I suggest we need to look at some of our issues through the other end of the telescope. And you heard Ben speak about education attainment, and it's celebrated almost that girls are now outperforming boys at every age and stage. And I fear, particularly as an educator myself, that some of the latest sort of curriculum development or some of those teaching pedagogies, I'm not convinced that in that pressured school environment where they're chasing down those Ofsted judgments and gradings, whether some of the very definite ways in which boys particularly learn are given the kind of time and space that is required for them also to achieve their optimum. Because I think what I'm most earnest about here is understanding that men have always been part of the solution. And I think too often today they're framed as the problem. They have always been part of the solution. And I think even in terms of women and the absolute discrimination and oppression that politically women have long experienced, and the dramatic change now. My own grandmother didn't have the vote at the age I became a Member of Parliament. But in terms of my political journey, my biggest cheerleaders, that would be my dad, my husband, and my 3 sons. Men are also part of the solution. So, in answer to that question around why should there be a minister for men, why shouldn't there be when the evidence weighs so heavily in, again in my own constituency, in terms of cancer detection and outcomes, men lag behind women in every category. And there are very definite reasons why men don't seek earlier intervention and why we need then a specific, tailored response. So there are multiple imperatives, and ultimately I would say to the person who asked me why on my way here, I would argue very firmly it's in women's best interest that men are their very best in every area of society, whether that's in the economy, whether that is at the heart of the family, in any and every area of life you care to mention. The world works best when both men and women can be true to themselves and to be their very best. But I'm going to wrap up my comments there because I can feel the questions in the room already, and there has been a wealth of insights brought into play. I will just end on one note, and that is to pay tribute to a charity in Eastbourne called the Band of Brothers. And if you want to understand the impact that a really positive older male role model can make, they bring into their sphere of influence young men who've often lost their way. They may not have had that father figure or had an abusive father figure in the past, and their lives are turned around. And part of that is rebuilding their identity, their sense of purpose, and restoring what is a really healthy, strong message around masculinity. Mm-hmm. And I think we've got some important work to do there.
Hear, hear.
Well, I think we've had 4 excellent speakers there on why we need a Minister for Men, so we might as well call that a wrap. I'm the chairman of the APPG for issues affecting men and boys, and the reason why I took this role on is because I do believe that if we help men and boys, then by helping half of the population, we actually, as Caroline said, help the other half of the population too. We've all got men in our lives. And if we've got good men in our lives, then society is so much better. But the headline statistics, I don't know if you saw the leaflet that came around today, are really quite astounding. 13 men will commit suicide today. 13 men every day. 75% of suicides are men, which is a terrible statistic. Life expectancy of men is 3.7 years lower than it is for women. Men are more likely to die of cancer and COVID. Rough sleepers, 83% of rough sleepers are men. And as Lord Farmer said earlier, 96% of the prison population is men. Now, if these were statistics for any other characteristic, then we would be saying, what the heck is going off here? And this is why I believe it's so important that we have a Minister for Men. Now, what would a Minister for Men do? Well, I believe it had actually taken an overarching holistic look at all the departments that government form and work with each of these. As Ben spoke earlier, education is such an important part. But as we also heard earlier, DWP, child maintenance services. Child maintenance, Andy's Man's Club. Just go off for a second. I went to an Andy's Man Club, which are doing fantastic work, and I would ask all colleagues and everyone to promote their Andy's Man Club. But one of the biggest issues that when you sit down and speak to them, and I had 2 full sessions with them where I sat down and actually participated and answered the questions like everybody else did there. Child maintenance services is one of the biggest issues that men are really struggling with. They don't get to see the children when they want to see the children. Child maintenance is costing them a fortune. They're living in bed sits, it's a whole array of issues. And the value that men feel for themselves because they can't provide for the children how they want to provide for the children is just absolutely, it's absolutely terrible. So DWP need to be brought in with it. Obviously, Home Office and Ministry for Justice, we need to deal with men in prison. I mean, the suicide rate for men in prison, again, it's absolutely terrible. Yes, men do deserve to be punished if they are doing something wrong, but we've still got to look after them while they're in there. We need to be rehabilitating these men, putting them back out into society so that they can contribute again. And I, like Lord Farmer, spend quite a bit of time in prisons. My constituency's got 3 and work with a company called Tempest Novo, or actually getting these predominantly young men actually into work while they're still in prison, which is fantastic. So when they come out of prison, they've already got a job, they're already feeling valued. I'll come on to value again in a minute. Health issues. I mean, there's alcohol, smoking, obesity, all these issues do affect men more than they affect women. Why? Why is this happening? Why are men turning to the fridge? Why are men turning to the pub? Why are men smoking? Why are men doing all these? And I think as a country, as a government, we're continually looking at the cure for something rather than the prevention for it. And I think if I can get a Minister for Men in to work across these departments, what is going wrong, starting with the family. I'm a huge believer in role models, huge believer. And I believe there's a fantastic organisation, it's called Lads Needs Dads, and I've worked with them and they are phenomenal. But young boys need dads in their lives, men in their lives. And as Ben said earlier, I went to one of my schools and it was the first time I'd seen a male primary teacher. So if you've got 44% of the population, 44% of children are from broken families where they're living at home with mum, predominantly mum, doing a fantastic job, doing all she can. But if you've got that a young boy there, he's got no male role model at home, and he's got no male role model at school until he probably gets to 7 years old, when he gets into, which is, it's disgraceful. We need men in these young boys' lives. And as Caroline said as well, I think the biggest champion of my daughter, and obviously mum's not here, but I champion my daughter more than anybody. I think she's absolutely wonderful. So it's not just the boys that need the dads. It's young girls too, and we need men in people's lives. And Treasury, obviously we need somebody to speak to Treasury because there's funding needs going into these organisations. We seem to have lots of really good organisations but scattered all across the country. It'd be good to have a theme running through so that we could all work to a proven model. DCMS, Digital Culture, Media and Sport, such a huge part in young people's lives. So every single department here, every single department I can think of, has got a part in men's and boys' lives, and we need somebody to work across all those departments to make sure that we can get our young boys on the right path, we can get them the role models that they need, and for ones that have already fell off that path, we need to be working with them to get them back onto that. And by getting better men in society, then we lift everything up. We do lift everything up. I think role models are so important. I just spend all my time running a role models initiative because I do think they are so important. And just for a young boy to see his dad treat his mum properly, for a young boy to see his dad talk to ladies properly, I just think so much of the other things that we try and put around, more police on the street lighting, things like that. If we've got good dads and good role models in young men's lives, then we don't need the CCTV, we don't need the extra police, we don't need all these other things. So let's try and get a minister for men so we can get the prevention part, and then we can really start having an overarching look across everything.